Going from rough lumber to finished flat square boards, it's a really important part of woodworking. It's a little bit daunting. One way to get around it is just start with pre-surfaced stock. Not a bad way to go. However, it is limiting in terms of what you can do, the materials you're working with, and so eventually I think you're going to want to learn how to get flat and square. It's a pretty simple process. It is a step-by-step process, so we need to keep the order of things in mind. And while there are different ways to go about doing it, a jointer and a planer is a really common method to go about it. Now, there's some confusion about the two different machines in terms of what they do and how they work together. A common question is, well, can I get by with just one? Do I need both of them? The answer is yes and no, but let me explain why you may want to eventually invest in both, and let me show you how they work. So in order to get started, I'm going to go ahead and start with the jointer. The jointer has a cutter head in the bed, and this is really, really good for getting one face dead flat. However, if we were to flip the board over, we could get the second face dead flat, but they wouldn't necessarily be parallel, and we're going to run into a lot of problems if we have boards with faces out of square. So that's where the planer comes in. The planer does a really good job of getting an opposite face parallel to the bottom face. Now, this is okay if you're starting with a flat board, but if you're starting with wavy stock, all you're doing is creating a parallel face that matches that same wave. So we're not doing any flattening there. So the joiner comes in to give us one flat face, and then we're going to take that flat face and head to the planer. But I'm going to go ahead and start by getting our face flat at the jointer and walk through some of the processes that I'm looking for and what I'm paying attention to in order to get that done. So when we're starting out, there's a really good chance the board is not going to be flat. What is important though is to have 2 points of contact so it's stable through the cut. If it rocks at all, it's going to throw you off. Another thing I like to pay attention to is the grain direction. Both of these Grizzly machines have spiral cutter heads with individual carbide cutters, and they do a really good job of pretty much eliminating tear out. However, on a typical joiner and planer with straight knives, paying attention to grain direction will give you a much cleaner cut. So with the jointer, I'm looking for the grain to be running down as I'm making a pass. I like to use a pair of push pads. However, it's really key that you're not putting too much pressure down on the stock, especially thin stock. If there's a bow or a cup and you press down so hard, you're temporarily flattening it out. By the time you lift off the push pads after the cut, the bow or arch is going to spring right back up. So starting off, if I find that I'm taking just too light of a cut, I can lower the infeed table a little bit just to make sure I'm getting some work done. I really want to be careful that I'm not removing too much stock and getting the stock thinner than it has to be before I go to the planer. As I'm using the push pads, I'm really keeping the stock down on the table, but especially on the outfeed table, because that becomes the reference surface as I'm beginning to flatten the board. Okay, so what I was aiming for on getting one face flat is not necessarily to get it dead flat all the way across. What I want to get is something at least, say, 70 to 80% flat to give me a nice reference surface when I go to the planer without removing more material than I need to at this point. So I've got some low areas here, but there's plenty of reference surface around that where we'll go ahead and work on the opposite face, and then we'll go ahead and clean up that other face later. So let's go ahead and head over to the planer. The planer is a little bit different animal than the joiner, where on the joiner, the cutter head was buried in the bed, and we adjusted the depth of cut by moving that infeed table up and down. On the planer, the cutter head is suspended above the table. In this case, we can adjust the depth of cut by, on some planers like this, raising and lowering the table, and others, the head moves up and down. With this said, whenever I'm starting, especially if I have multiple boards that I need to flatten, I want to start pretty conservatively and adjust this to ideally take maybe just a skim cut off of all my boards. What I don't want to do is start too thin and have a thicker board get stuck inside the machine, and then we have to readjust all of our settings. And so I'm just going to go ahead and loosen the hold down knobs and just lower the bed until I can comfortably get the stock started into the planer. At the planer, with the segmented cutter head, grain direction isn't all that important. However, in a typical situation, because the cutter head is sitting up above the table, I want the grain direction running up as I'm pushing the stock through. And after each pass, I'm going to raise the table a little bit before I make the next cut. Generally, I aim for about a 1/16 of an inch. That lets me get some work done pretty quickly without the risk of taking too heavy of a cut and ending up with some problems that I need to take care of later. I'll keep working on the top surface until that's nice and flat. After that, I can flip it over, take some passes to clean up the rest of that jointed surface. Once I have that top face nice and flat, I'm going to go ahead and flip the board between each pass. This is going to ensure that I'm taking equal stock off of each face and hopefully keep things flat as I go. Once I got that top face nice and flat, I was able to flip it over and hit that initial face. And actually this board here just has a little bit of a remnant left over here. The idea is that I want to get to two flat and smooth faces and still have hopefully some extra stock in order to dial in my final thickness. From here, I'm just going to flip back and forth, so I'm taking equal stock off of each face, which is hopefully going to keep things nice and flat. Once I'm down to my final thickness, I'm going to go ahead and head back to the joiner and true up one edge. All right. We're back at the joiner with a little bit different intent. When we were working on a face, the bed of the joiner, especially the outfeed table, that was our reference surface. So all of our concentration was getting our stock flat to the table. And then once we got past the blade, all of our pressure was down along that outfeed table to make sure that we were nice and flat. In this case, we're already flat. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get an edge square to the flat faces. So now we're going to have the stock positioned vertically against the fence. So now in this case, our reference isn't necessarily the table, it's the fence itself. So I'm really focusing on getting a lot of side pressure against the fence to keep me nice and square. Now, in order for that to end up square, I've got to check my fence and make sure that we're starting out square. And on a joiner like this with a pretty long fence, I want to be checking for square on the outfeed table just ahead of the blade, because this is really going to be my reference surface. If there's a little bit of wind in the fence, hopefully there's not, this is where it's really, really key. So I'm going to double check that. That's a little bit out. And that looks pretty good. So again, as I'm feeding the stock, I definitely want the pressure against the fence. However, as I begin to flatten that edge, I also want to make sure I'm applying downward pressure to the outfeed table as well. After each pass, take a look, and I keep going until I have a nice clean edge. It's important to take a slower feed rate. That's going to give you a better quality edge right off the jointer. Typically, I find I can go straight to glue up off of a jointed edge. For the final pass, I'll make sure I go extra slow. Take a look, that should be okay. Okay, so that gives us a nice flat square edge to our faces. So now we've got two parallel flat faces with an edge square to those faces. I still have rough ends and a rough opposite edge. So from this point, the table saw is going to handle the rest of the milling. I'm going to go ahead and rip an edge parallel to the first and then cross cut it to final length. After that, I can start making some furniture. Now, this is a pretty wide board. So I was able to run my hand across the blade pretty safely. I want to think in terms of having sort of at least a 3-inch clearance around that cutter head. So if this were a narrower piece of stock, then what I would do if this wasn't this high is I would have my hand here and then just switch it over to the outfeed once that was out there enough and then continue past. So that's really about it. So starting at the joiner to get a flat face, heading to the planer to get the opposite face parallel to that, then back to the jointer to get one square edge, and we're off to a really good start.